Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
This is Jim O'Shea. I'm a former editor of the LA Times and a longtime journalist and author. And I'm talking today with my friend and colleague, Charlie Madigan, also a longtime editor and an author and a longtime journalist. Charlie and I want to discuss this current controversy over John Fetterman, who is running for the Senate in Pennsylvania, and a lot of the commentary about his speech patterns in a debate last night with Dr. Oz, and whether or not this would hurt him in the election. And at the root of all of this is whether brain damage is so severe that you can't recuperate and you can't recover. And Charlie has a particular expertise in this because he had some serious problems, medical problems involving his brain. And I'll let him talk about what happened. Charlie?
Charlie Madigan from Evanston in Illinois, and Jim's buddy and longtime colleague. 2.5 years ago, I went to the hospital to have a simple procedure to relieve some pressure in my brain that was making me what neurologists call wet, wobbly, and wacky because you have too much synovial fluid in your brain and your ventricle. And I learned all about this, and they put a thing called a shunt in my head that drains the excess fluid so that I could get back to normalcy. My normalcy lasted for about 1 week, and then I had a seizure at a restaurant and had to be revived by firemen. And what had happened was that I got a severe infection that took out the entire left side of my brain. The left side of your brain is where all of your executive functions live. I mean, ability to understand things, to add, to go through things you've done for years. It was all gone. And I got out of the hospital after about 6 weeks of intensive antibiotic therapy. And my son handed me my guitar, which I've played for 50 years. I didn't know how to hold it. I didn't know how to talk. I didn't know how to walk. I was completely incapacitated. And my neurologist told me, no, that'll all come back, but you have to work at it. And I did and I'm not bragging, but I did very hard. All the musical skills back. You can hear me speaking right now, which I couldn't have done 2.5 years ago. My capacity for analyzing and understanding things is complete. I still make stupid mistakes, but I realized that I did that before I had the incident. I was dumb in some ways long ago. So that's not a surprise. But the important message here is that brain injuries, in most cases, are not permanent unless the damage from the stroke is so severe that you can't do anything. And that's clearly not the case with John Fetterman.
So, Charlie,
Admittedly, yeah, go ahead.
did this did what happened to you? Is it resemble a stroke?
Sure. The complete with seizures, but the difference is that mine was an infection that could be repaired with antibiotics. Stroke damage cannot be repaired, literally repaired. The part of your brain that's damaged by that is damaged by it. But what happens, and this is the fascinating part to me, is your brain rebuilds the circuits that it needs to do the tasks that you lost. And that's what you're seeing with Fetterman. I'm sure he's going through intensive physiotherapy, but that's what anybody who has a stroke has to go through.
So
Um,
did this happen gradually? I mean, did you get up one day and it was a little better than the next day and the next day and the next day, or did it kind of all of a sudden come upon you 2 months after you had this infection?
no, I had a blessing. Once the antibiotic was done, which was miserable in itself, but once the antibiotic was done, I had really good advice from my family. My youngest son is a spectacularly intelligent young man. He did brain research. And after I came home, he and had the trouble with the guitar. He said, "Here's what you need to do. You need to practice guitar for 2 hours every day. You need to do scales on the piano. You need to type. You need to write." And I did this diligently for weeks, and it was extremely frustrating. But he was absolutely right; it comes back.
So
And
did this start like you started off, you couldn't remember how to play anything. And
Couldn't
what
do.
did start doing chord practice or picking practice, or how did you start your recovery process?
I started out with scales on the piano, which I hadn't done since I was 15. And fortunately, we have a great piano, so I practiced really hard on that. And then at the same time, I started writing again a novel that I had been working on for years about a coal mine disaster that my father and grandfather was involved in. And after a couple of weeks, I began to realize that that was coming back too. And it was hard to get it. But what I was able to do with that is write a novel of about 100,000 words, which is too big for a novel, but
Right.
about 100,000 words that has a complete narrative, characters who speak to each other. And I didn't know that I could do any of that. I was afraid I'd lost all of that, but I didn't. And I suspect that Fetterman is in the same position. The more he does what he does, the better off he'll be.
Were you aware? I mean, when you say, I couldn't do the, you couldn't play the guitar, you couldn't write. Were
Right.
you aware of that? Were you thinking, God, I can't write anymore, or God, I can't play the guitar, or was it like a blank?
Um, I was aware that I couldn't do what I used to do, and that was the really painful part of it because I've, as you know me very well, I've enjoyed myself all my life, and especially in music, and that was profoundly upsetting and frankly depressing. So I had a lot of help from doctors with that and psychiatrists, and they basically said, "No, no, be patient." And it's the hardest thing you have to do is be patient with yourself because, again, you were so accustomed to being able to do these things that it was very hard to live without them. But I couldn't live without them, so I rebuilt the skills, and I can do every bit of it now, and it's a good feeling. But that was a really dark period. I admire him so much for doing what he's doing because he's blown right past the part of it that would make you want to jump off a building, and
Mhm.
and I think that that's admirable, and it shows what kind of a man he is. He's a very strong character. Um,
Were there things, Charlie, that are there things that you just can't you lost? Other things that you just can't do anymore because of this, or are you really back to being able to do everything you could do before this happened?
it's it's a real complicated situation because in the interim, of course, I had a heart attack that killed me for 8 minutes and all sorts of other shit that just too complicated to even mention. But the point of it is anything that I found as a disability, I worked on. I had trouble with balance. And to this day, work on balance bars and all sorts of exercises first thing in the morning, and it gets me back into the situation I need to be in to walk without stumbling. I'm very sensitive about looking like I'm disabled, which I think is, if you're aware, anybody who has that problem would feel that way. So I work very hard to overcome those things, but they do go away, or you do get rid of them somehow. But so I had a lot of help, and I had a lot of support, especially from my family and my wife, who just has been like a saint because I was difficult, very difficult to deal with. But the fact that I can talk about this now is a measure of how much things have changed.
Uh, Do
You're
you
not
think?
aware of it when it's happening.
Do you think that I mean, are you are you now capable? I mean, one of the questions I think people raise about John Fetterman is could he become a senator? Could he think and could he do could he perform the functions that you would have to perform as a legislator? Do you think if you were you could go back to being a journalist, being a fully functioned journalist, and
Sure.
do things happen? Do you do or are there exercises and things you have to do every day that would take time away from you doing your job?
No, I don't think there are because, again, the functions have returned. I think once I finished that book and once I completed doing a blog and a bunch of other things that I did pretty diligently, I was convinced that the problem here is not whether
Whoop.
you could very easily tempora o mores, I can't do anything anymore. But that's not how it is. And one thing that people have to understand about me, and I'm not putting myself in the center of all this, is I do many things that are risky, that are seemingly beyond my skills, just so that I can show myself I can do them. I mean, I have a whole garage full of very sophisticated tools I use to build musical instruments. And my doctors said, nothing sharp for the first 6 months. Don't do that. You could cut a vein and bleed to death in your garage. And I paid attention to them for exactly 6 months in one day. Then I went back in there and started working through everything again, and it works. It all works, So
Did this is going to sound strange, but
no,
you referenced before your brain kind of rewires itself,
yeah,
and I've read that before. Did you feel it rewiring itself?
you can't. And I got confused about that early on because I wanted to be able to pretend to see these synapses and things growing back, but that's not how it works. The best explanation I had was from my psychiatrist, who's also a neurologist. And he said, you need to fill your day up with experiences so that when you sleep at night, those parts of your brain can rebuild themselves. So you're not conscious of it. It's just that over time, things become more and more understandable and more recognizable and more familiar because those things are rewiring themselves. Now, I'm not going to kid you, there's part of me that will never be the way I used to be, but it's not any part that anyone would notice. It's like, okay, here I am. Um, the issue with these kinds of problems is especially when look, I'm old, I'm 72. The issue with these things is you have buckets in front of you to hold symptoms. You don't know which one is causing the symptoms. You think, oh my God, there's a brain problem when it really is an aging problem. Or, oh my God, there's a headache problem when it really isn't that at all. Or a hearing problem or whatever you happen to put in their bucket of symptoms. And you have to keep that stuff very clear in your head. So, I mean, I become like a miniature neurologist and psychiatrist at the same time. You know?
So, did when one of the big issues that people have raised with John Fetterman is his speech patterns. Uh,
Sure.
when he talks, it doesn't sound like it's a coherent sentence sometimes.
Hmm.
Did that happen to you?
It did, and again, it was a matter of months. And what would happen is you get the tenses and the context of the sentences mixed up, so that your nouns and your verbs wouldn't agree, or you would pick the wrong word to explain a situation, a synonym that didn't quite fit, and that took a while to get through. But but
How does that work? Does it are you can you think of the sentence and you just can't say it, or can't you think of it?
you get a lot of things tangled up. It's like in conversational stuff, where you used to respond like we're talking right now immediately and make some sense. I wasn't capable of doing that. My words were screwed up and my thoughts were screwed up because I couldn't be logical at that point. But again, I mean, my son and I did a lot of studying on which part of the brain does what function. And what made me not afraid of any of it was understanding what kind of damage I had and how it repairs itself and what side of the brain still worked. I mean, it was really interesting to me that I didn't lose my sense of empathy. I didn't lose my ability to be emotional, which some people lose completely. I didn't lose my ability to be emotional. I have my affect. I have my personality. I can still tell dirty jokes. It's that I remembered from years ago, my old dirty jokes. But and I mean, part of this is just a difficult collection of exercises you have to do. I mean, I started every day for a year repeating the lyrics of songs I had learned 20 years ago. I know a lot of songs, but I would lay in bed and just repeat them in my head, the most difficult songs I could figure, and also try to visualize the music. And this might sound like nothing to people who haven't had this problem, but I felt tremendously challenged by it. And even to this day, I mean, I had a gig I was doing a couple of weeks ago, and I had to think really hard about the context of the song and the words and the phrasing and the chording of the guitar and all that. But everybody said it came off really well, and I thought, okay, I can do that. I wouldn't have done it a year ago because I was
Yeah.
too insecure about my abilities, but it comes back. I wish people would understand that about Fetterman and stop this, mumbling about disability. You can't, my whole idea, my whole thought about disability has been transformed. I mean, I don't look at people anymore as what they can't do. I look at people as what they can do. And that's not just me, it's with everybody that I know. And somehow it's made it much more comfortable for me. There was one of those things. Makes it much more comfortable for me to sit with other people who are my age and have their own set of problems and not be judgmental about it. I mean, I went out to drink. That's the other thing. You can't drink anymore. Non-alcoholic beer is fine. You know, no, you don't get a buzz, but it tastes like beer. So I went out with about six guys the other night to have some non-alcoholic beer and talk about the process of getting a novel published. And not all of them were functional in the sense that they were absolutely fluid in how they could talk about it. But I didn't worry about that. I was listening for what they said, not for what they didn't say. And it was a really interesting process for me because I respected every one of them and was able to communicate with them. And I thought this is a sign that you got to be a lot less judgmental about stuff and understand that people are remarkable characters and they can rebuild stuff without even trying, just by experiencing, just by being together, by having support. And Fetterman is a model of this. This is a strong, sensitive, intelligent man who had a bump that he's repairing. And, you would think that if he's running against the medical doctor of all people, you would think Dr. Oz and his people would understand that because they have to have dealt with it many, many times in his career. He
So
knows
from
the
you,
people who do it.
so
Yeah.
from your experience, just I know this is a difficult thing to judge, but from your experience, would John Fetterman be better off just backing out of the race and giving himself some time to recover, or if is pushing ahead and trying to deal with this and get in a high profile position a good thing?
My argument would be that the therapeutic thing for him is to do exactly what he's doing and push ahead. And for people the other thing about this, for people who think he's diminished in some capacity, those are people who don't know what the Senate's actually like. I mean, you know what the Senate's like. I know what the Senate's like. I've covered state legislatures for years, and I was constantly amazed at the level of stupidity and boneheadedness on the part of those people, and they didn't have a disability to blame it on. So I thought, well, so Fetterman stumbles a little bit with his speech. At least he's not stealing money, because
Yeah.
a lot of them were into it for that, or amassing power so he could wreck other people's careers. And if you look at his own track record, it's stunning. He just did some great things in his life. And even though he wears shorts and a sweatshirt and is tattooed up like a motorcycle gang member, it doesn't matter. He's got a big heart, and he basically displayed that through everything he's done as mayor in Braddock and as lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania. So, what's the problem?
Well, I mean, I think it seems to uh, what you're saying is that this is more of a problem of politics than of medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Do you?
anybody. I mean, I'm sure his doctors tell him a completely different story. That he said they're telling him do this, do that, do as much as you can because everything that you do will help you not only prove to yourself you can do it, but help you repair the damage that you've had because of the stroke. It's just I mean, if you're living in a nation that's aging, that's a cliche because it's always aging, but we have a nation with a very high percentage of senior citizens, and there's an array of problems that cross that whole group. And to think that this thing makes John Fetterman exceptional is just plain wrong. A lot of people have gone through much worse and come out the other end completely intact and ready to do their jobs, ready to live their lives, to be with their families. So, I think what I'm arguing is I'm not saying cut them a break. I'm saying know what you're talking about. Instead of just assuming based on some myth that this disability should prevent him from being a senator. I think the fact that Mehmet Oz is not from Pennsylvania should should sort of disable him as far as being a senator is concerned. But yeah, who knows what people think about that? But anyhow, um,
I kind of, it's funny. I remember covering Congress many years ago as a reporter for the Chicago Tribune and seeing Congressman Mel Price, who
oh,
at that time was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee,
sure,
and he came up to the press gallery to talk to reporters. And the poor guy was in a wheelchair.
hmm,
He couldn't talk. His wife had to talk for him, and he
hmm,
was reelected.
yeah,
So
well,
I think that was a time when people probably when name recognition and factors such as that were more important than a person's health, or people
sure,
didn't. And then the other thing is people didn't see it, and people
no.
didn't see it on social media. And do you think now, with the new world that we're in, it makes people with disabilities or people that are ill or people that are having temporary troubles, does it make them more vulnerable to in a political campaign?
I think it does, but I think that's more about us and the way we respond to politics than it is about the individual and what the individual presents. I think you know as well as I do that this has become an extremely mean business. Um, the other aspect of this is from, my God, from Franklin Roosevelt onward, people have been willing to look past major medical difficulties. John Kennedy was like a science project. There are all sorts of problems that these guys had that people made took no notice of. I mean, all the way back to Grover Cleveland, who had a rubber jaw because he had jaw cancer, and that was done when he was in the White House, and he was reelected. You know, so it's like how much attention do you want to pay to this today? Just because we have the capacity to be snotty doesn't mean we should be snotty.
Yeah. Well, you look at Franklin Roosevelt, uh, who was clearly disabled.
Yeah,
Jack Kennedy's back problems were terrible, but they hid it
sure.
from public view. So you have, but now we have somebody who's stumbling over words, and it appears that the election is very close.
Yeah,
Uh, do you think that it clearly has become an issue?
sure.
How can you're a journalist and I'm a journalist, but from your perspective, how can a journalist handle this? I mean, I read a piece this morning by a reporter from the New Yorker, a political reporter from the New Yorker, that said basically the guy had a terrible performance. And
Yeah.
then I've read other accounts that are far more sympathetic. How would you handle this as a journalist, which you're trying to cover a guy with such an obvious problem?
Well, you can't ignore the debate performance because people put so much weight on debate performances. But as a journalist, I would be writing sidebar articles about the nature of brain problems and what the possibilities for healing are and what you see in his behavior that hasn't been affected by this stroke and try to come at it from a completely different angle. Because the obvious thing is to say, well, he's had a stroke, he can't be a senator. Well, you know, you could come up and take away the word stroke and say he's stupid, he couldn't be a senator. Plenty of those got elected. He's ugly, he can't be a senator. Plenty of those got elected. Or he's a great character and he has a bit of a disability, and they got elected too. So I think that's the aspect I would want to put the most emphasis on. And again, you know, if you talked about this, if you talked about other disabled people in our culture about this, you'd be banished, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You'd be banished as insensitive and uncaring and all sorts of things. And just because we're dealing with a public figure doesn't doesn't lessen that responsibility, you know? I won't ever again, and this is because of my experience, I admit it. I won't ever again make a judgment of somebody who's been set aside by some disability that most other people would say, "Oh, that's he's done." No, he's not done. You writers, poets, musicians, loads of people work way beyond the point at which people think they can't. I mean, Willie Nelson is what 96, and he has to sit maybe not. I can only imagine.
You're breaking up a little bit, Charlie.
An interesting problem, but I don't think that journalism is being as complete about this as it could be.
So there's some others in the room. Would they like to come up and talk? Ask Charlie some questions? I don't know if you joined a little later. Charlie is talking about the fact that he had a severe uh, brain infection that was similar to a stroke and has recovered. And we're talking about how the parallels between that and what's happened to John Fetterman, the candidate for the Senate in Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
Okay. Hello.
It's a thunderous response.
Well, I think the uh, recovery you staged is amazing, and I can't. I don't know. One thing that would seem to me go hand in hand with this kind of a problem is the you not only have to overcome the physical part of this, but also it's got to be a real struggle with depression.
Sure, sure,
And
but I mean,
how did you overcome that? How did you? I mean, did first of all, how depressed did you get, and how did you overcome that? And how did that have an impact on the physical challenges you were dealing with?
at the beginning, I woke up in the morning, and this is after the brain injury and after, unfortunately, a heart attack that followed it. That may or may not have been related. I woke up in the morning wondering whether I was going to live for the rest of the day, and more sadly, whether I wanted to live for the rest of the day. And that's a real hard confession to make, but it's the truth. When you feel that you've been so diminished that you can't do the things that defined yourself or the things that made you happy in the past, it takes you to a very dark place. But the only way you can fix that is to go do those things that made you happy in the past. Identify them, fall into them, or dive into them, or sit on them, or whatever you have to do to make yourself happy. And make yourself happy because that's an important part of recovery and of getting rid of these feelings that you're useless. The only way to prove that you're not useless is to do something useful, and that's what I did. And it took a long time, but I'm happy that was my attitude, and that attitude came from my wife, who has been great for me. She's been my protector and my chauffeur and my monitor and my behavioral specialist, and my sons, who have stood around me whenever I sort of started to totter, pushed me back up. So I had a really strong support from my family, and of course my dog, who doesn't understand any of it, but remains a faithful friend. So it's like, those are things that seem simple until you lose them and need to get them back, and then you begin to realize what value they have.
Well, now you're in a very supportive atmosphere. You've got a wife and children and all that, and that's really helped you recover. John Fetterman, if elected, will be going into anything but a supportive atmosphere in the United States Senate. Do you think that this will inhibit his ability to recover? Because he's going to be in a hostile atmosphere. Hello?
Yeah, there you can you hear
Hello?
me?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I can hear you.
that's good.
Did,
Go ahead.
did you hear the question?
No,
Okay, I was saying that you were in a supportive atmosphere, a very supportive atmosphere with a loving wife and children, and that's really what helped you recover. But John
sure,
Fetterman's going to be going into anything but a loving atmosphere in the United States Senate. In fact, it's going to be hostile. And do you
sure.
think that that kind of atmosphere that he'll be able that he'll be able to make a recovery as robust and as effective as yours when he's in such a hostile atmosphere?
Well, I'll go back to a piece of advice that a priest gave my son when he went off to college, a very hard college that was full of all sorts of aggressive people. And the priest sat him down and he said, "Son, don't ever take crap from people who don't love you." And I think that applies to John Fetterman too. I mean,
Yeah.
he has the people who love him are the ones he should value. If the rest of the Senate wants to act like baboons, that doesn't matter. Of course they'll be harsh. Of course they'll be unkind. They'll talk about him behind his back. But in reality, you can't be defined by that. You get defined by the things that are closest to you. And I know that it's a tough place for him to be, but I think part of the measure of him will be how he does that if he gets elected. I hope.
Yeah.
Um, that's about all you can hope for. You can't hope for people to be more compassionate because we've been down that road before. They aren't, in the most part. But again, you go through this kind of experience, and every your view of everything changes, and it's valuable change to me, anyhow, because it's you don't look at people on the street anymore the way you used to. You don't look at bums begging for money as though they're bums. They're people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we went to lunch the other day, and there was a guy, this sad man, sitting on the curb with his legs out in the street. And people have talked to him for years, and I said, hey, but you can't fix that problem, but you can feel for him, and that's all that's really required. You just don't want to walk past the tramp on the street and treat him like he's some kind of an animal. Um, People should not walk past John Fetterman and think there's something wrong that can't be repaired. That's what I believe in my heart. Am I right or am I wrong? I don't know. You know, I don't know, but I hope so.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think, Charlie, thank you very much for this conversation. You've been very candid about your own health and your own
Sure.
uh, problems that you faced. What would be kind of the final piece of advice if you were talking to John Fetterman? What would you tell him?
Don't let other people define you. You define yourself. He's always done that.
Yeah.
He's always done that. And that will be his personal salvation, I know, and maybe his political salvation too. So
Well, thank you very much, Charlie, for your comments and your observations. And I hope and wish deeply that your recovery will continue and that
I,
we'll have many more collaborations.
I hope so. I don't have any option. This is what it's going to be for me. So, and I understand that, but this is delightful for me, and I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Appreciate you and the help we got from April and everything else.
Yeah.
Very good.
Okay, and for those of you who joined, thank you for listening, and we're going to be signing off now.
Bye.
Bye bye.